Welcome, folks. I'm glad to have you with us today. I think this is episode 5. I think that's what I put down, episode 5. And got a very exciting episode for you today. But first thing, I got to do a little housekeeping here. We've got several balls in the air planning for October. As many of you know, I used to tell Ozark ghost stories at national parks and different things. And we had a good time doing that and wanted to do some more of that. And fall is upon us. October will soon be here. It's going to be here quicker than we expect. It's time to get a little spooky with the podcast. We've planned some fun topics and some amazing guests who will join us at the WWO. Maybe we could have a live event on Halloween night. Maybe a ghost walk, maybe around the square in Marshfield, and I can show you where Dick Cullen was actually lynched. If we get enough stories to share, how about a live event? Maybe a ghost story roundtable. Wouldn't that be fun? Send me your thoughts. I hope today's episode primes the pump, so to speak. Of course, we can be reached at Wild and Woolly. That's Wild in Woolly, Ozarks at gmail.com. I think "and" was taken. A few of the Halloween seasonal topics will be monsters, ghosts, witches. Got a lot on that coming up. Haunted spots in the hills, and much more. A lot of this is going to have an emphasis on storytelling. I'm very passionate about storytelling. So be sure to follow us on Facebook. We will alert you as we migrate to other platforms as we grow. Watch out for TikTok and Instagram coming. As we get the wagon rolling here. Takes a lot to push a wagon, but when you get her going, it's not so hard. Do you have an Ozark supernatural story to share? Something that fits in what we just described to you? If you want to share that story or suggest other stories of the macabre, drop us a line once again at Wild in Woolly. That's 2 O's, 2 L's, 1 Y, Ozarks at gmail.com. We have a couple of events. I want to do this because the Ozarks has always been a pretty tight-knit culture, and different events around the Ozarks really display that and display the goodness and the hometown theme that so many of us in the Ozarks cherish. And so I want to give you a couple of events of Ozarkian interest. And if you have an event you would like for me to read off, drop me a line. You've got the email by now, wildinwoollyozarks at gmail.com, just in case you hadn't. It's also available on our Facebook. You can message us there or email us from there. But first event we have next Saturday. This is the 13th, the day this is being recorded. This will be out before then. Marshfield Harvest Days, Friday and Saturday, September 20th and 21st on the square. It's a wonderful homecoming event for the fall in town. There's music and there's events, and so check that out. You can go to the Marshfield Chamber of Commerce and get more information. Yours truly will be serving breakfast at the Masonic Temple from 7 until noon. Drop by and say hi and bring me one of those stories. I'll need a break. Another exciting event, we've got a new book being released and a book signing on October 11th at Mount Vernon's Apple Butter Days, which honestly is a long-standing famous show or craft festival in the Ozarks. Ozarks Alive publisher and author Caitlin McConnell is releasing her latest book, The Ozarks Pie Project, that day in Mount Vernon. They are having a pie potluck, and she is signing copies. The book is 48 pie recipes from vintage Ozark cookbooks, along with some stories and other historical info about traditions, pie suppers, for example. And I think that's kind of what they're having. Sounds like. Be a good place to go and eat. About 100 pages long with photos and recipes. Also shares the people in the organizations who shared the recipes. Cookbooks will be available at the kickoff, and they'll be for sale at Ozarks Alive. For further information about this event or about the book or how to get a copy, go to ozarksalive.com and check it out on Facebook as well. On October 18th in the evening, Haunting at the Mill in Montauk State Park. This is an evening event where they share some of the curious history of Montauk and some supernatural Ozarks fare. As I understand, the event is free to the public and going to be an exciting night. I think I will be down there as well. And I don't know yet what I'm going to quite be doing. I think I'm going to be portraying a local Dent County gentleman. We'll see how that goes. So if you're in that area, be sure to tell us you heard it on the podcast. Drop by and say hi and reach out. We'd love to meet you. Also, if you haven't checked out our friends on the Ozarkian Folk Chronicles, please do so. Their current series, Movements on the Margin, examines various religious group and fringe groups of the Ozarks. Check it out. Is there something we need to know about? Drop us a line. Once again, that email is wildinwoollyozarks@gmail.com. And now for the program. Have you ever wondered what you would do if while on a walk in the woods you encountered a kettle of silver dollars? Or maybe a cave with silver ingots stacked like cordwood? Such tales of hidden wealth have fed the dreams of Ozarkian men for more than 2 centuries. A question I've had since boyhood is exactly what is the evidence to support mining, Spanish mining, in the Ozarks. My own quest for buried treasure began at 12 when, inspired by Viola Hartman's Ghost of Gobbler's Knob, a book purchased at the Old Mill Antique Store in Reed Springs. I think I was 12. Her book, which was short on ghosts, put me on the trail of Alf Boland's murderous escapades and the questions of where he hid his ill-gotten gains during the Civil War. I gathered maps, scoured old texts, searched for legends and hearsay alike, and much to the chagrin of the local librarians, planted myself in the floor beside the local history shelf. My dreams of instant wealth were quickly dashed as it became apparent what few facts we had told little. New leads often contradicted the old ones, and to top it off, it appeared that the whole darn thing probably lay under the waters of Table Rock Lake. It was disappointing, but I still have a bit of the bug. At this age, my attention has shifted from hunting actual treasure to collecting local stories and lore surrounding some of the more famous tales of the Ozarks. My fascination with getting down to the kernel of truth, no matter how small, led me to today's guest. I'm pleased to have with us today Robert Myers, who, as a hobby since his youth, has tracked down treasure tales across the Ozarks. On today's episode, he will be casting more light on the old stories and discussing the validity of such Ozark treasure tales. Robert, I want to welcome you to the Wild and Woolly Ozarks. Thank you for coming.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it. We get to finally meet, if not in person, virtually, I suppose.
I want to tell everybody kind of how I tracked you down. Missouri State University on YouTube has a whole series of lectures, and some of them are really, really interesting. Some of them, they may be interesting, but the quality, maybe the age of the recording or the type of recording that was done at the time is not good. And yours was good for the first little bit to catch me and get me intrigued, and then the sound was not good through the rest of the thing. And so I had to listen with headphones up against a go to great trials to get your voice. And what I found was golden, and I'm like, man, I've got to meet this guy. And so we finally get together. So, but I'm going to basically turn it over to you. Tell us how you got started on your, I guess, hobby. Is that fair to say? Passion, obsession?
Sure. Yeah. Hobby, passion, sometimes obsession, I suppose. I started when I was a teenager. So I grew up in Bentonville, Arkansas. I was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma. But growing up in Bentonville as a teenager, there's 2 things that got me into this. First was there was a treasure hunter named Gene Lovell, who got permission from the city of Bentonville, Arkansas, to dig in Park Spring Park for what he thought was Civil War era buried treasure. So, when I was about 14 years old, I thought that was the greatest story ever. And I went down and visited Eugene Lovell several times. And then that piqued my interest. But then also, I our church youth group visited a local nursing home, and this was in the early 1980s, actually late 1970s. And in the Bentonville nursing home, there was someone I met who described himself as a retired bank robber. And his name was Albert Beck. He was on the Cherokee rolls of 1896, and he was almost 100 years old at that time. And so I became really fascinated by his tales. We actually became pretty good friends, and I used to go meet with him a lot. I recorded about 12 hours of tape of his stories. And I started researching and looking into his life and the validity of his stories. And that's basically what got me hooked. So I began two things. One is that I've been collecting these stories ever since then, but also I've been documenting and creating an archive, you might say. So currently, I have about 15,000 documents on the Ozark legends of buried treasure. And I go about this as a historian and a folklorist. I'm not a treasure hunter, but I think there's real validity to these stories, and it meant a lot to so many people. So many people, not just as entertainment, but also who believed in some of these stories so strongly, and even used all of their savings and sometimes even mortgaged their homes to pursue these buried treasure stories. So even if they're not valid, even if they don't even exist, it doesn't matter to me so much as just it meant something to so many people. And so they must have had meaning and value in that way. So I've been collecting these stories. To go back to my own story, I attended the University of Arkansas, received a degree in anthropology. And so along the way, I got training in archaeology, museum studies, anthropology, and including historical archaeology. I worked 2 summers at Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home, and Colonial Williamsburg. So I had a pretty strong training in historical archaeology. So all of that background gave me the basis to look at this in a different way and to actually kind of analyze these stories. And that's basically how I got interested in it.
So, what did the bank robber's name? You said Lovell?
The bank robber, Albert Beck.
Beck. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Beck.
Yeah.
So, did he claim to have something buried somewhere, or?
Yes. Well,
Okay.
what's interesting is, according to him and himself, he was one of the greatest bank robbers of American history.
Kind of like
And he went on,
spring robber.
yeah, he went on for days and days and days telling you all the details about all these bank robberies in Oklahoma, Missouri, Kansas, Arkansas. And the amazing thing is that he knew the details about what actually happened in these locations. Even though he was not a literate person, he could not read or write, he knew in great detail what happened. And so when I was a teenager, I believed every word of it. I hung on every word he said, and then I began researching it, and then I didn't believe any of it because there was too many contradictions. But then I came around to realize the backstory behind it was that he actually was imprisoned for decades in various state prisons, and he was actually in prison at the same time as some of these famous outlaws. And I think what he was doing was he was hearing these stories and then placing himself there at these locations, including, for instance, the great the infamous bank robbery in Harrison, Arkansas, where Henry Starr was shot, mortally wounded. And Albert Beck knew all the details. He knew the name of the cashier who shot Albert Beck. I'm sorry, who shot Henry Starr. So again, it's fascinating to have known him and his stories and learn more, because it's really brought history to life just even researching these stories.
Well, yes, and you make a couple of really good points. One of them is that the real treasure is now the stories of the treasure, kind of a mining of the miners sort of thing.
Right.
Um, but I love any type of even modern treasure story because it shows how quick the facts get completely out of whack with what really happened.
Yeah.
DB Cooper, and the thousands of dollars that have supposedly turned up here or there or should be there. There's more lore there than probably fact.
Mm-hmm.
And they say they may have solved that one, but I just use that that's not really from the Ozarks, but I use that as an example of that happened. I'm almost 50, and that happened in the early 70s or late 60s. It's within the span of time that somebody ought to be able to figure that out. It's not 500 years ago or.
Right. Yeah. Well,
So I go back to your bank robber. If there is a bank robber loot, it ought to be more solvable than something that happened a long time ago.
right. And that kind of brings me into one of the first one of the things I learned in collecting these stories. Even though I have files on more than 800 different locations within Arkansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, Ozarks, 800 different locations where these treasure stories are, there's only 7 genres of these stories that I found. There's Native Americans, Spanish, American lost mines, Civil War, criminal loot, and then hidden caches. And then finally, there's a small category I call disasters. The reason I mention this is that I would say that there's it's there's the Native American and Spanish treasure stories are total fantasy. They just didn't exist. American lost mines, maybe like 2 out of 100 might have existed. Civil War stories, there's actually there was some things hidden during the Civil War. And then the criminal loot is interesting because I think there was occasionally people will find money that was hidden by criminals. And so there was some validity to those stories. And then finally, hidden caches. Those were, for instance, people just hiding money around the home, on their property, in the days, for instance, when banks didn't exist or people didn't trust banks or when banks would fail or when people would rob banks. So the hidden caches, there's actually a fair amount of that actually does exist. So I'd say of all these genres that I'm talking about, there's maybe 2 where there's some stories that are real, and then the other genres are largely fantasy. But I still think they're interesting, and they're valid because they meant all these stories meant something to people.
If you think about disasters, one of the things that sticks out in my mind, and it's not really in the Ozarks, but it's the steamboat Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
What a treasure. And, it wasn't really, it was the boat sank. Nobody got killed, but that's kind of cool. I've always wondered, Marshfield was wiped off the map by a tornado. And I always wondered if jars of coins or little buckets of coins, when they tore up the foundations, if they found anything and rebuilt,
Sure.
fascinating. One of
Yeah.
the only treasure tales that I've ever encountered that's been solved was in town. We had a local character named Colonel Paul who ran a blind tiger drugstore where he served liquor, and he was an attorney, and he bought precious metals, just a general ne'er-do-well in a lot of ways. But after he had died, some fellows found his papers, and they dug up a bucket of gold and silver coins behind his old shop.
Right.
The catch thing does happen. I've got a couple other examples, but I won't trouble you with them. But so when so you divided these up. I think I don't disagree. That seems to be fairly comprehensive. So I know before we get into where these legends originate, or no, go ahead and take us through that, because I have a couple of questions and I want to ask you about some real evidence, and let's get to that here in a little bit.
Okay, sure. Well, maybe it's because of some exposure to folklore studies. There's certain questions that fascinate me, and one of them is whether folk tales, where they come from, and whether they are derived from independent invention or diffusion or both. Now, what I mean by diffusion is, did the stories come from somewhere else? Were they imported by people who came here, or just the stories were spread to this area? One of the fascinating things I find is that the stories in the Ozarks, the treasure tales, track remarkably similar. They're remarkably similar to those in, say, Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee. And I guess that makes sense because a lot of the people who eventually settled here were from those areas. But, some of the stories, you can just take the story told in the Ozarks and change the place names and some of the people's names, and they're indistinguishable between stories told in, say, Pennsylvania.
Well, yes, and if you look at Webster County, where I'm from, or the general area, the pre-Civil War migration was from the South, and then the bulk of the migration was from those northern states and from the North after the Civil War. And so that's one of the things, and like we examine, I'm particularly fascinated by the cultural phenomenon of Ozark witchcraft. And it's a mongrel of a whole bunch of belief systems sort of cast under a broad tent. So that's continue. That's interesting.
Well, one of the things I found is that I just assumed that a lot of these stories were passing from mouth to mouth, so to speak. Have you ever heard of what they call a FOAF story? FOAF.
F-A? No,
FOAF. A FOAF story, which is folklorists used to refer to those. I don't know if they still do, but it's a friend of a friend. So if you hear someone say, "Hey, I had this friend who was telling me that he had a friend who did such and such,"
right.
Those stories are very common. So that's like oral traditions. But one of the things I found out is a lot of these legends of folklore were spread by newspapers. The newspaper stories just spread incredibly. So that was a source that I was surprised at, but it was a very strong source of these legends and folk tales. Anyway, I just thought that was interesting. One of the things I've done is I've interviewed people, and I'd say, "Where did you hear that story from?" And they would tell me. Then I would go interview that person, and then I would take notes on what that person said, and I'd say, "Where'd you hear that story from?" And they would tell me, and I would go interview that person, and I would take notes on that story. And so through some of what I've done, you're able to see how the story has subtly changed, or maybe they didn't change. I think that's kind of interesting.
Very much so. And that becomes the I kind of refer to it as the transplant effect. Is grandpa from Ohio tells an Ohio story in the Ozarks to a bunch of kids, and he makes it to where it fits there. And they actually believe it.
Right.
Or it's sort of maybe there's a ghost story involved. Some good treasure stories involve good ghost stories too.
Yeah. There's certainly an element of magic, and I can talk about that in a moment. But to go back to your question about where the legends originate, one of my major findings in all of this is that buried treasure and deception go hand in hand. And what I mean by that is that outright fraud played a surprisingly large role in buried treasure stories. And specifically, there was what I would call a golden age of buried treasure swindling from about 1880 to 1940, when there were actually buried treasure fraudsters, you might call them, or swindlers or charlatans, who made a living moving from place to place, trying to get people to invest in buried treasure and lost mine stories, the search for them. And so a surprising number of these stories were actually originated from outright fraud. And I don't think that anyone is really understands that.
Huh. Well, that's interesting because, you know, if you're a connoisseur of Ozark books, local published Ozark books, or regionally published books, it's they make it very clear that Spaniards were here and there were mines all over the place, and DeSoto was so industrious in the very short time he was here that he managed to mine most of northern Arkansas and southern Missouri. So,
Yeah.
uh, uh, so here's what I didn't think I referred to it in the intro. I always hear the story of the breastplate, the arm,
Mm-hmm.
Spanish style army, or the hilted sword, or
Mm-hmm.
the helmet, the very distinctive helmet. In fact, that darned helmet's been on billboards. That darn helmet has been on the front of Phillips Steel books, and oh, his name just escapes me. The W.C. Jameson, yes,
Yeah.
W.C. Jameson books, and it itself is sort of a cultural, a newer cultural icon in the Ozarks. The fact that we have this supposed Spanish connection from way before any of us were here, or
Right. Right.
any of
That's
the European people were here.
yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great word for icon or iconic,
Yeah,
because again and again, it's a symbol of the Spanish exploration and perhaps occupation of the Ozarks. And I have collected those stories as well about finding of swords, helmets, etc. And so I've also traced back those stories as far as I could go, and they it's like a will-o-wisp. It just disappears the farther
sure.
back you go, and it didn't actually. No one could actually point to any of these that anyone's found. It's again, it's a folk story. A friend of a friend. I had a friend who had a friend who found a Spanish helmet in a cave. Things like that. And then you go talk to that friend, and then, well, it wasn't quite like that.
Right.
So I've collected a lot of those stories as well.
Well,
The truth.
yes, and one thing I want to say here is, y- y- those don't exist. There's no historical society. There's no state museum in not in locally that has any real evidence of them beyond just probably maybe a campsite passing through. And I'm speaking of DeSoto.
Right. Yeah. That's actually a really interesting um, point, because there's only been certain campsites discovered anywhere in the southeastern United States with archaeological documentation or artifacts from Hernando de Soto. He had an expedition that came into the southeastern U.S. in, I believe it was 1539, and um, marched until, what was that, 1544. And there's sites that have been discovered in Florida, Georgia, and now most recently in Mississippi. It's pretty spectacular location where iron artifacts were found. And that, again, that's only been the last couple of years, but there's really hasn't been a single DeSoto campsite found west of the Mississippi River. And it's possible that one might exist because there were two places where they wintered over for long periods of time. And so it's possible that there might be a site found someday where it was a Native American settlement. And there was also where the DeSoto's expedition camped, or what was left of them. But that has not been discovered. What has been discovered west of the Mississippi River is in central Kansas. There's been some locations where they found chainmail from the Coronado's expedition. And then most recently in places like Arizona, just in the last couple of years, they've discovered an actual small fort of Coronado that was built along the way. And someone found a small, I guess you would call it a small brass cannon. So
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty spectacular, but that's an actual archaeological find. So where they found it in situ, and they have the archaeological context. It's not just a friend of a friend story.
Let me ask you something. In the sites east of the Mississippi, you said that recently in one found some iron. I guess they do like a metallurgical assessment on that to determine where its origin. Like I know that you can do that. Uh,
Yes.
don't ask me how, but I know they can do that.
Yeah, that's true. There's several ways they can analyze it, and one is just in the type, shape, and form, and the methods they were created. And then there's another method where they can look at the composition of the metal,
Mhm.
and, and there's uh, certain signatures left behind in terms of the composition. And there's also ways that you can find the origins of where those metals came from, where they were dug from. So through
Right.
that, they're able to, and then finally, if you find those metals in the archaeological context of a like a late prehistoric Native American site, that's that's very useful too.
Sure, sure. But as far as we know, there could be a DeSoto campsite in the Ozarks, but it has not been discovered.
Possibly, maybe on the margins of the Ozarks. That's an important point. Is that Hernando de Soto never really got into the Ozarks.
Okay.
So they just they skirted the southerns of the Ozarks. Except that Henry wrote Schoolcraft, the author, in the 1800s. He traced what he thought was DeSoto's route, and he's in his mind, DeSoto came right up the White River to the headwaters of the White River before turning around. And I think probably that old 1800s interpretation has probably led people to believe that, yeah, DeSoto was in the Ozarks.
I mean, it's plausible, but there's all kinds of things that are plausible that you can't prove. I mean,
Right, right. But certainly, a couple of points. One, DeSoto's expedition, like really all of the expeditions of the Spanish into what they called La Florida, which is the greater southeast, all of them that were spectacular failures.
right.
There was not one single one that you could say was successful. There was one. It was they held their own, but there was just problem after problem. They would go in with 1,000 people and they would come back with 400 people. And in one case, they came back with 3 people. I mean, it was just horrible, you know, from their standpoint. So Spanish in the Ozarks, there were no expeditions that I know of the Spanish into the Ozarks, and there was not really any settlement, colonial settlement to speak of in the Ozarks, but there were a few small settlements of a few hundred people in the late colonial era of like the 1780s, 1790s, and on up to 1803.
Tell our listeners where those were.
Well, let's see. Primarily they were in the lead mining regions along the eastern end of the Ozarks around St. Genevieve area, um, and Potosi, Missouri. There was St. Louis, which was, I guess you'd say, on the margins of the Ozarks. That was a small settlement. Let's see. There were a few individual
Madrid.
farmsteads. Yeah, New Madrid's another. Yeah, thank you. New Madrid, Little Prairie. So it was really along basically what you'd say the western side of the Mississippi River. And that was in part purposeful because the Spanish the Spanish rule, I'll call it, of the Louisiana Territory, they were really afraid that the Americans were going to run them over and run across the Mississippi River. And so what they did was that they decided, okay, our strategy is going to be we're going to attract disaffected settlers from the eastern, from the United States over to Spain. We're going to give them large land grants. And then we're going to, with these American settlers, we're going to form militias all up and down the western bank of the Mississippi River. And those militias are going to defend Spain. I'm sorry, defend Louisiana.
Right.
That was the thought, because the Spanish did not have enough troops to defend this gigantic border. It was huge, you know. And they really weren't trying to defend Louisiana. What they're really trying to defend was Mexico. Mexico was where they had all these the silver mines that were making them a lot of money, and Louisiana was pretty much just the buffer zone to them. They didn't really see any intrinsic value in Louisiana, the colony itself. It made a little bit of money here and there, but it just wasn't. They just didn't see it um, as a value.
So now we have a situation where we are not even sure that there is any uh, hardcore Spanish activity in the Ozark Mountains. We do have European activity up toward the lead area, French activity later on. What happens? What kind of happens after that colonial period ends? What take us from or the the French period and then the Louisiana Purchase.
Well, Louisiana was a French colony until I believe 1765, and then it became a Spanish colony. And then Spain held on to it until 1803. It that's kind of an interesting story. I won't go into the details, but to make a long story short, it was colonial until 1803 when it was purchased by the United States, the Louisiana Purchase. So the Louisiana Purchase was pretty much a blank slate to Americans. They just didn't know what was out there. But they knew that there was this land, and that the land would become valuable to Americans and for American settlement. So stories about lost Spanish mines and mineral wealth were often used as a way of, it was kind of a stand-in for the value of the natural world. So in other words, people would talk about valuable Spanish mines in areas where to highlight the really value of that land. So I guess you'd say it was kind of a stand-in for what people envisioned to be the great wealth that could be ultimately come out of the land, whether that wealth was the land values themselves, or farming, or later on minerals and oil. And it seemed like that whenever land was about to open up for sale by the federal government, that these stories really ramped up, these stories about valuable mines and minerals.
Do you know of an example, early statehood, pre-statehood, of Ozark's treasure legends being used to promote, or were they just more in general? Like, were they promoting anything specific, or were they more in general?
Pre-Civil War, there weren't that many promotions that were going on. There were some expeditions to find gold out from Arkansas. These expeditions left Arkansas. There were rumors about gold being found out on the Great Plains in Kansas and Oklahoma. This was in the 1840s and 1850s. But they didn't find anything, and they came back empty-handed and disappointed. It wasn't really until after the Civil War that the investment that started taking place in the Victorian era started going hand in hand with using these buried treasure tales and lost mine tales in order to entice investment into these stock companies. And it really exploded on the scene in about 1880. It chugged along for a little bit. In the 1870s, there were a couple of lost mine stories that were used to entice investment. Like there was the Stalker, Stocker, lost 10 mine in the 1870s in the eastern Ozarks. But then about 1880, the hinges came off. The hinges were blown off. I mean, it was incredible. It was just what happened about that time was the convergence of the railroads, stock markets, and investment from northern investors who just blew the lid off of um, just reckless, crazy investment in these lost mine stories. And it was a multi-million-dollar business at that time. In fact, it was probably in the hundreds of millions of dollars
Wow.
in the late 1800s. It wasn't a small thing. It was a major phenomenon, and it was based on fraud, basically.
There were large scopes of land after the Civil War, and you probably know this, but I'll do it for the folks at home. Greene County had 40 people per square mile. And when the Civil War was over, Greene County had 5 people per square mile.
Yeah.
And the Ozarks was largely depopulated. A lot of that land had been owned by speculators prior to the war in large chunks, and it came for sale. People who just settled on it and took it. There's all kinds of fun stories. But there was a lot of ground in the Ozarks for sale. And you got to find a market. There's
Yeah.
also some convolution, in my opinion, with the mineral wealth that gets found around Joplin, Neosho, and they try to extrapolate that and take it to other parts of the state, particularly in the Victorian era.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, there's a lot of mining activity that went on in the Joplin area. And what's interesting is the Moffat, I forgot his first name, but he was one of the leaders of lead mining in Joplin.
Right.
He did go out and look in other areas. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
he searched down in southern Arkansas in the Ozark Mountains for either lead or guano in the caves. And this prospecting kind of contributed to these treasure stories as well. It just kind of provided a basis for some of them.
One of the things that I've always heard, and I know many of our listeners have heard too, is that when you mine a certain amount of lead, there's a certain amount of silver that's generally with it. I know that exists in lead mining. I don't
Mm-hmm.
know the percentage or anything. Is any of that true in the Ozarks?
It is true that, to take a step back, the lead that has been mined in the Ozarks, and especially around Joplin, Missouri, and the tri-state mining district of Oklahoma, Kansas, and Missouri, that was one of the greatest lead outputs and zinc outputs in world history. It was just phenomenal. And there is a very small percentage of silver that went along with the lead that was mined. And in fact, there was so much lead being mined that even with that tiny percentage, Missouri was listed as a state producing silver for some years, and it was maybe like the 5th or 6th state in the country for silver production, based
Right.
simply on that tiny percentage. Now, having said that, there is one location in the Missouri Ozarks that was a legitimate silver mine. It was the Einstein silver mine over in the eastern Ozarks, and that is has to do with the specific igneous. I'll call it intrusion. I'll probably get that wrong. Geologists can correct me,
Is this
but
around
it's an area
Johnson
where there's
shut-ins? Is this around Johnson
yes,
shut-in? Okay. Okay.
yeah, exactly. But that is one area where there was a legitimate silver mine. It didn't last very long. It was a few years. So I can't you can't say categorically that there's no silver in the Ozarks. It's just it's not the same as the stories that we've told, where someone walks into a cave and they're seeing, like stalactites of silver hanging down from the
Right.
ceilings of the cave. I've heard that so many times.
Or onyx or some other precious thing they're going to mine at.
Yeah, right.
Uh,
Yeah,
one of my
right.
favorite stories is about the fella who goes out and delivers a baby for a farmer, and the farmer can't pay him, and he gives him a pouch of bullets. And the farmer
Yeah,
next fall takes them out hunting, and they're all black, and he figures out that the guy had making bullets out of silver.
yeah. You know
Uh,
what? I've heard that quite a bit too. And I should take a step back. And when I say lost mines don't exist, I think there are some lead outcroppings that people would some of the early American settlers in the 1800s that that are legit.
Right.
And what I mean by that is that before the railroad era, lead, it wasn't very profitable. It took a lot of transportation costs and fuel in order to smelt lead. So if you didn't have a railroad nearby, that the lead you found on your land wasn't going to do much good commercially,
Right.
but you could use it for your own purposes, I suppose. And so if you had an outcropping of lead on your land and it wasn't very deep, then periodically I imagine you would go over and dig a little bit and smelt it down to for your own personal needs, such as for bullets and things like that. So I've got maybe a dozen stories about so-called lost lead mines, and there could very well be something to those stories.
Yeah. Yeah. That I agree with that. And I agree with that because I'm from a county where there was lead, little small open pit mines during the and before the Civil War. And then as soon as the railroad came in, all the lead and jack that they could get that was reasonable to get, economically feasible, they did. And just tore the country up.
Right.
Truthfully, you can still see it today. But yeah, so let's why don't you take us through a couple of these tales or that are sort of instrument the different elements you bring together and talk us through one, maybe not one where like, we'd talked ahead of time and said, let's save the Yoakum Dollar and Bread Tray Mountain. I want to do something special with that in a future episode. But take us through maybe one that is lesser known to the folks out there.
Okay. Well, what I'm wondering is, would you be interested in hearing about the Lost Louisiana mine first as kind of a general one, and then go into the more specific one?
You just take us through. You start there and however you want to do it.
Okay.
We're
All
not
right.
on a time schedule here. I got to be done by about 4 o'clock, and I figure all the batteries will be dead by then anyway. So you just
Okay.
take it away.
Thank you. Okay. First, maybe I could tell you a little bit about what's called the Lost Louisiana. And this is a classic tale from the Ozark Mountains uh, in Arkansas and Missouri, as well as the Arbuckle Mountains in Oklahoma. And there's even a small area in Texas where the Lost Louisiana mine story occurs. But I would characterize it as an American legend about buried Spanish treasure. It's been sought since the Victorian era. And kind of the core story is that there was a Spanish expedition which concealed a rich gold mine in the wilderness of Spain's Louisiana colony, and that's where the name comes from, Lost Louisiana Mine. And the story was that this expedition, in returning to New Orleans, all but one of the party was killed by Indians. And so the story that's the core of the story, but over time people kept adding to it and changing things, such that later those that hid the treasure were not Spaniards, but there was variations where people said it was buried by Freemasons or Sephardic Jews exiled from Spain who brought a fortune in gold and jewels with them, or a Catholic treasure, or an Aztec trove brought from Spanish Mexico. Now, I do think that the Lost Louisiana mine, if you trace it back to its origin, I do believe it sprang from the colonial era, because there was a mineral curiosity located in or near modern Pike County, Arkansas. That's in the southwestern corner. And there was a report from 1778. Bouillonnais, Governor Bouillonnais reported in 1778 that there were gold diggings on the upper Little Missouri River, which is a tributary of the Washita River. And then there's an 1803 memoir on the Washita District where they said that the gold mining had been abandoned due to either, quote, suffocating vapors or Indian harassment. But by 1804, American William Dunbar noted that he called them pyrites or fool's gold on the Little Missouri River. So it's quite possible that these hunters crossing southwestern Arkansas had mistaken fool's gold for gold. I do believe that's where the story probably originated from. But today's Lost Louisiana Mine story can be traced back to 19th century stock promotions in the Ouachita Mountains. In the 1870s, there was a huge mining boom in Montgomery County, Arkansas, and then followed by another mining boom in the 1880s in Garland County, Arkansas. So the first time the term Lost Louisiana Mine came about, it was published in the Arkansas Mining Journal in 1880. So the Lost Louisiana Mine, that term, the first time it occurred was in 1880. It was spread in part by the 1880 book, The Legends of the Ozarks. So the author was James Buell. He was a pulp fiction writer who was very involved with, you might have even headed up the publicity for the Chicago World's Fair and the St. Louis World's Fair. I mean, he was of that stature in terms of publicity. He was very good at it.
He
So
also would write, I think it was him. I've got several deals. One of them I covered before was the murder of Clifford Vere Shaw. He wrote a very fanciful version of that about 5 years later, or 3 or 4 years later, and changed the place and everything, but it was the same story.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it was a big feature. I bet it's 1,500 words or 2,000 words. And
Yeah.
I think it was in the Dispatch, but it may have been in an Arkansas paper. I don't remember.
I'm fascinated by him. I just think he was
And what was say his name again?
he's a very interesting character.
For our
His name
newspapers.com aficionados out there, say his name again because they might want to check him out.
James Buell, Buel.
Buel, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. James W. Buell.
Sorry for the interruption. Continue.
Hey, no problem. Well, in this was followed by a spectacular mining bubble that developed in at nearby Bear, Arkansas, Garland County. So there was incredible promotion of mining in Garland County, Arkansas, primarily for gold mines. And this became a national sensation. It attracted lots of northern investment. I don't know why, but specifically from Nebraska. Well, I think I know why. Because two of the mineralogists, the fraud mineralogists, were from Nebraska, and I think that's the reason why so many investors were from Nebraska. But they sold stock in lots of different mining companies, including the Lost Louisiana Mining Company. And again, there was these charlatans, such as the so-called Reverend Samuel Auge and the Anson Titchener, and they were imposter mineralogists who bilked investors in lots of different states. But the bubble really burst when the Arkansas Geological Survey did a very thorough investigation of all of these mines and published the report in 1888 and exposed the Lost Louisiana, many other mines as fraudulent. The people were, the investors were incensed, state officials were incensed. The state geologist was hung in effigy in one location. People were so angry.
Usually not a public service role that attracts a lot of attention or ire.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. In fact, I think the Arkansas Geological Survey was disbanded for some years, I believe. So it was a big deal, but they were right. There was no gold that existed there, including at the so-called Lost Louisiana mine of Bear, Arkansas. So then it died down for some years, but by 1900, the Lost Louisiana mine had really expanded to the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas. And what's interesting is that this is when a series of treasure guides started showing up on the Mulberry River in Franklin County, Arkansas. And these treasure guides were described as either Spaniards or Mexican or Native American, or sometimes several of those, or maybe all three, just depending on the telling.
So may I pause right there? So that's those because I think I may have encountered a reprint of one of those at one time. So tell me what we're in the 1890s.
Yeah, 1890s.
Okay. Where would you have gone to find one of those, or did they have a title, or is there anything to go on on that? Because I know some people follow along with this are going to want to look that up.
In terms of
Did it have a title like Beale's American Guide to Treasure in the Ozarks?
oh, but they were, I call them the treasure guides,
Uh-huh.
but they weren't really guidebooks.
Okay.
Yeah, at that time. They were basically, again, this was that golden age of buried treasure fraudsters or charlatans, whereby these people were showing up claiming
Whoa. Okay.
to know the location of buried treasure, and they could show you for a fee.
Okay. No place for corruption
Yeah,
there. Go ahead and
right.
give us some examples of that, because that's fascinating.
Yeah. So what's interesting is in 1900 there was just this burst of searches for Spanish treasure and mines in Northwest Arkansas. So you had multiple locations going on at the same time in 1900. For instance, I may have to pull up my notes here, but in 1900 you had someone who described himself as from Mexico City, going by the name of Charles A. Nichols, who showed up in Gravette, Arkansas, actually between Gravette, Arkansas and Sulphur Springs, Arkansas. And he was trying to sell the location of minerals for $300.
Wow, seems reasonable.
Yeah, exactly. Well, um, so I looked in the 1900 census. I did a search in the 1900 census for anyone born in Mexico of the name Charles Nichols. And the only person in the whole country in the census was someone in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, named Charles D. Nichols, born November 1844 in Mexico, occupation mining. And
Oh,
he was living at a boarding house.
really?
Yes. So that was in May 19 and June 1900. So in June 1900, there was newspaper reports of someone from Eureka Springs going with the Spaniard to Eden's Bluff at Montanay, Arkansas. And you
Right.
may or may not know the story of Montanay, but
Now in the Ozarks, we call that Montanay.
yeah, Montanay, sure. Yeah,
You got to learn the language, Robert.
right. Sorry,
No.
Montanay. Um, but at Montanay, I'll call it. Sorry if I
There
mispronounced
you
it.
go. We'll let it pass.
at Montanay, as I call it, this self-described Mexican or Spaniard touched off this a great deal of digging in a high bluff overlooking the White River at a place called Eden's Bluff, and they did find quite a few Native American artifacts in the dry caves, and these were legitimate Native American artifacts, hundreds or more years old. And this Spaniard or Mexican would use the finding of these artifacts as confirmation that he was on the right track and that what he was saying was true. I think that's fascinating.
What was the base story? What did he tell them had happened, that how that treasure got up on a bluff?
Well,
Onlooker, that's going to be the first question I'm going to ask.
yes, right. So his story was basically that an ancestor of his was on a Spanish expedition, and their party was attacked by Indians or Native Americans, and that they had to hide their treasure in this cave or in this bluff, and that there was only one survivor, and that survivor was his ancestor, and that there was a map passed down through the family ever since those times. And this man shows up in 1900 saying that I have the map, and if I'd like you to help me find this treasure, but I'll need your financial backing.
Mm-hmm.
So that was in June of 1900. In August 1900, there was an quote an aged unknown Indian showing up in a magazine Arkansas, just outside of Magazine Mountain in Logan County, claiming that his father and other Indians had worked a gold mine on Magazine Mountain 88 years previously. So that's very specific, but 88 years previously and been attacked by Mexicans. And then within about 2 or 3 months, there was someone who is described as a Mexican working at this Las Louisiana mine location in Franklin County, Arkansas, on the Mulberry River, where they formed a stock company. They hired men, they purchased mining supplies, and the land was leased. And according to newspaper reports, they had broken into an old tunnel and found stone marks and, quote, hieroglyphics, or what petroglyphs, I suppose. But here's the interesting thing. The newspaper said, it's understood he was the same man who sought treasure at Eden's Bluff the previous summer. Oh. So the thing is, you've got one person going around from place to place to place. Wow. There's evidence that the Charles Nichols in Gravette, Arkansas, was the same person who was at the Eden's Bluff, who was the same person who was at the Las Louisiana mine. So I think that's tremendously interesting.
So keep unpacking Mexican Charlie here. Tell us more, because this is fascinating.
People, I actually can find very little about this person, but he returned multiple times. So this Charles Nichols, people said Charles Nichols, that's obviously a pseudonym. That's not his real name. That's what people were assuming, because he said he was from Mexico, and they said he went by the name Charles Nichols. But he came back not only in 1900, but he came back in 1904 with investment to return to these same locations. He went back to Gravette, Arkansas, at what was called at that time, Blackberry Cave. It eventually became Spanish Treasure Cave. And he did work.
And that's still in Arkansas?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. A man showed up when I'm almost certain it's Charles Nichols. It must be him. But in October 1904, there was a mysterious man that came to Green Forest, Arkansas, Carroll County. He came to a real estate office with mineral samples that he collected around town. And he refused to give his name, but he said he was 54 years old. He was from Mexico City, and he had lived in many sections of the United States, Central America, and South Africa. And he was there to investigate minerals and other subjects. So that was in 1904. The last reference I can find to this Charles Nichols, or Mexican Charlie, as they called him, was in 1914, where he dropped by the Las Louisiana mine location. And after that, I don't know. I can't find any record of him. He just disappeared. I'm still trying to find out who he was. Now, I have a strong.
I was just gonna ask, where has your investigation led you in trying to pursue who this very innovative con man was?
Well, to go forward, I can say that at the same time there was another Mexican Charlie pulling off the same stunts in the same counties, and I do know who he was. His name was Charles D. Gonzalez. I don't know if Charles Nichols.
Two Mexican Charlies.
Yes, two Mexican Charlies.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. So, I feel pretty confident that they were different people. For a long time, I thought they were the same people because they both used the name Mexican Charlie and they were in the same county at the same time. But there's subtle differences. For instance, the first Mexican Charlie, Charles Nichols, he seems to be about a decade or more older than the Charlie Gonzalez. And there's some other differences as well, but I think they're different, but I can't tell you for certain. But I can tell you Charles D. Gonzalez, who I have been pursuing since a teenager, I can tell you a lot more about his life and who he ended up being.
Okay.
He showed up 1905 at the Las Louisiana mine site on the Mulberry River near the town of Cass. So anyone who drives what they call the old pig trail from Fayetteville, Arkansas down to I-40, they would drive through Cass, this little town. And nearby, that's where the Lost Louisiana mine was dug for decades, and a lot of activity, a lot of money was spent there in the search. And they had multiple people, these treasure guides there living on site, directing the diggings, including Charlie Gonzalez.
Wow.
So Charles Gonzalez, his life to me is a mystery before about the age of 50. I don't know who he was before then. And so his life afterward, I can trace pretty well. He was married in the year 1915 in Polk County, Arkansas. And then he had several children. And he continued on this life of very treasure swindling, basically until he died in 1946. He stopped in the 1930s, but anyway, I can trace Charlie Gonzalez to more than a dozen different treasure locations where he was directing diggings going on.
So, if I have this right, he lives in Arkansas. He goes, spends several months out. He swindles for, I guess, to support his family, and then he goes back home and then drifts to another place and repeats.
Yeah, basically. Except for he never really made any money, so I don't
Huh. So he did
I don't
all
know
that.
how he
Didn't really.
right. I don't know how he got by financially. Well, he didn't. He lived pretty much hand to mouth. His family was impoverished. Um, and that gets to the question of motivations. Why did he do it? Why do you fail and keep doing what you're failing at for 30 years? It's a good question. I haven't figured that out.
It's how you become a legend. That's what Billy Joe Shaver said. So I guess you become a legend. So and now he is.
He is, yeah, he is, at least in my mind, he's a legend.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, do you do it for the money? Do you fool yourself into believing that one day you're going to strike it rich? You know, um, or are you doing it for something else?
I always wonder if it started with a kernel of belief, and it started. I discussed this, but it started with maybe he did have an actual map, and maybe he actually was trying to do it, and it didn't play out. And he's like, he got swindled into buying this map, and it didn't play out, but he figured out a way. I really like the attention. I really
Yeah,
like this and this and this, and he would get by
yeah.
that.
It's possible that he started out as a believer, and then you just don't know. And
Megalomaniacs and fabulists are nothing new. In fact, we celebrate them. We
right. I
pray
mean,
to them
he
on
might have
this
liked the
podcast.
attention.
Sorry.
What's interesting is it took me a long time, but I located the family of Charlie Gonzalez, two of his grandchildren, and I've been working with him for years and years to try to identify who he was, and we still don't know who he was. The
Really?
amazing thing is, this led me to learning how to use genetic genealogy,
Mhm.
and I've been, I have access to their information, their genetic genealogy information. They've granted me access in order to help them out. And I must say, even though they have tens of thousands of DNA matches on multiple platforms, I still cannot identify one single match I can confidently say was related to Charlie Gonzalez. All of those matches are their other three grandparents. I can't find one that I could say is him necessarily.
Huh. That's something. And
Yeah, it's
that's that may take care of itself over time. You just need the right person to swab their mouth.
well, exactly. Maybe it's
More out there in the universe.
yes. Either the right person hasn't uh, matched, or it might be possibly his family were immigrants and they're from a group that don't participate, from a country that doesn't participate that much in genetic genealogy at this time. You
Sure.
just don't know.
Sure. And lines die out. Family lines die out too. I mean,
Yeah,
you find yeah. I always I don't know. I don't want I think I'll keep my genetic code private.
sure. Yeah,
So uh Take us through if you've got another one or want to expound any on more on this on the con man side of this. Take us through that, Robert.
Well, maybe I could take a step back just generally and just talk about um, con men generally and buried treasure swindlers. And I'll go back to, I'm going to take a step back a
Sure.
long way back, but this really has kind of a European origin in that there were in most areas of Europe traditionally, there were people that we now call like cunning folk. It might have been a cunning man, wise women. Some you might think of them as a fortune teller or a clairvoyant or a seer, and they were locals who people went to regularly to for a whole variety of things, including finding of lost and stolen objects or even buried treasure. But these were people who had long-term roots in the local communities, and they were typically tolerated by authorities. What's interesting is the English Witchcraft Act of the 1500s, the first English Witchcraft Act. Yes, they it made it a illegal to practice witchcraft, but it also tried to make illegal the cunning folk as well. In fact, the very first offense named in that English Witchcraft Act of the 1500s is purporting to show the location or find buried treasure. So this is a tradition that goes on a long ways. They were the ones who were stationary. But then, of course, there's been for centuries now traveling fortune tellers and clairvoyants. So in the United States, um, they would they would call themselves everything from European wizards to what we might call the Romani people or the Roma people or gypsies of today. In fact, the city newspapers, the late 1800s, early 1900s, they would have dozens and dozens of advertisements for fortune tellers, often with the tagline of "locates buried treasure." Now, because they were, in part because of their itinerary or transitory, the profession was riddled with with criminals who tried to extract as much money as possible from their victims and then disappearing. So these are kind of like maybe the basis or background for these buried treasure swindlers. But on moving forward, there became like um, treasure hunting guides. They were, you might say, they were specialists instead of these the fortune tellers or cunning folk who might be asked questions about anything from um, love and relationships and money and making fortunes. And oh, by the way, buried treasure. You had these specialists who um, offered their services to find buried treasure or interpret signs and symbols to find buried treasure, sometimes for compensation, sometimes not. The locals who stayed put, there's an example I'll give of Jasper Combs of Madison County, Arkansas. I've copied his papers from the late 1800s and early 1900s. And there were others. And again, the local authorities would pretty much tolerated them. But then you have these traveling treasure guides like Charlie Gonzalez and Charles Nichols, and they were the mysterious strangers who would seemingly appear from nowhere. And the best, I would say, were masters of deception who could enchant their victims for weeks or even months at a time. This was not the sort of fortune teller coming through town and quickly doing a short con, but the best of these traveling treasure guides were masters of deception who could do a long con, meaning they would not only take the money in your pocket, they would not only take the money that was in your bank account, but potentially all the money that you could borrow as well. And those are the ones that I think that are particularly fascinating. And as I mentioned, that there's this golden age of buried treasure swindling from about 1880 to 1940, where there were so far I have files on about 200 of these buried treasure con artists who are crossing the country.
Wow. Um, so we really find that the only basis for what we consider the classic Ozark treasure tale with the helmet and the breastplate in the cave and the Indians and the mysterious stranger that shows up. It's all just a story. The treasure is in all this lore that's out there. Uh, are there any of them that are at least plausible or that you might want to go look for if given the opportunity?
Well, of the Native American Spanish, no. There's nothing that I would have any interest in going out and trying to find because it just doesn't exist. But there are a few examples that I have looked for when I was a teenager, and there's a lost mine that probably does exist. I'll start with the lost mine story, which is in Shannon County, Arkansas. I'm sorry, Shannon County, Missouri. There was a so-called Lost Slater copper mine. And in the 1830s, there was a man named Slater who was mining copper ore, and there was records of them transporting it on barges down, I believe, the Current River and downstream to New Orleans. And I believe even that some of it was eventually smelted in Great Britain, if I'm not mistaken, either Baltimore or Great Britain. So that actually existed. And then we found out that Slater found out that, oops, the copper mine was not on his land. It was on someone else's land. And he tried to get access to that land. There's some lawsuits that are on record. He was unsuccessful. And then he covered up or hid that location. So I think there's probably something to this Lost Slater copper mine in Shannon County, Missouri.
That's one of them that I've always thought because they assayed the copper. They knew what percentage the copper was, and there was a record of it. At least that's what I'd been told. It had far more to go on than a breastplate with a map on the inside of it or something.
Right. Yeah.
What of all of these? I guess we're going to kind of wind this up here. It's been wonderful to have you with us today. But what is your favorite story? What is your other than the hunt? You love the hunt for these. But what is your favorite part of all these stories? Your favorite component?
Well, I think they're entertaining. They're fun. I love to hear them for various reasons because not only are they entertaining and fun, but it reminds me of my youth, you know. So there's that sort of nostalgia aspect as well. Um, those are the things that are fun. And then also it's intellectual pursuit, I suppose. And I'm learning things all the time.
Yeah.
I've learned about all these European traditions that I never knew about for instance, the German Venediggers, which are these mysterious foreigners that would show up in Germany in the 1400s and 1500s they were dark complected and spoke a foreign language, and they were out there looking for these mineral deposits in Germany. And so you had the exact same story, so to speak, in Central Europe taking place in the 1400s through the 1700s with the Venedigger.
Yeah, same story told twice and repeated often and over and over.
Mm-hmm.
What are your future plans? You've accumulated this massive, I'm going to guess what's a massive body of lore to hear you describe it. You shared some stuff, got detailed notes on so many different things. What are your future plans to do with that?
Well, first and foremost, eventually my archive will go to a good place and it will become publicly available. My goal is to save this information for posterity. There's been so many times where I've copied people's collections and then that person passed away and then their families had no idea what I was talking about when I asked them about it later. The documents, for instance, that's happened again and again and again. So first and foremost, I want to create this archive for posterity. And then second, I would like to publish, and I'm not even sure what format at this point. One idea that I have is to publish a series of books specifically as biographical sketches of these buried treasure swindlers. So I thought about doing sets of these books, one for instance, the central continental U.S., the southwestern, a different one for the southwestern U.S., another one for the northeast, another one for southeastern United States. That's the one I'm thinking about. Telling the story from beginning to end of these buried treasure swindlers and their lives, their personal lives, their professional lives. Um, it's pretty crazy. Some of the lives that they were living, not just with their victims, I'll call them, but just what was going on in their personal lives, all the risks they were taking, all the ups and downs. It's pretty amazing.
Well, it's certainly been amazing to hear about it. And I know that we have barely scratched the surface. Keep us updated with any new finds that you have. Keep us when you get that book ready to go. We want to have you on again. We want to talk about it. Also, we're going to have you back because I want to do a bread tray mountain. I want to take that one from beginning to end, and that's still going on to a degree. I want to unpack that one. And so we'll do that sometime in the future. How can people follow you or get a hold of you, Robert, if they have a treasure tale, or they have something that falls under what you're interested in here? Well, how can they get a hold of you?
I'd say probably the best way is to reach me by email. And I'll give you my email address. It's GEOCULTURAL at yahoo.com. Geocultural at yahoo.com.
Thank you very much. I'm going to cast upon the water here for a moment. Should you have a treasure tale, or you have a disagreement about anything gone down here today, we'd love to hear from you. This is an open forum. I love to discuss this stuff. If you've got a treasure location or a map or a breastplate or a helmet or something, reach out, or a bucket of Yoakum dollars, we'd like to hear from you. And if there's a tale out there to be solved, let's solve it together. And so, gentle people, thank you for joining us today for a visit with Robert Meyer. If you enjoyed our time together, give us a like and hit that subscribe button. Be sure and hit that ding-a-ling thing so you don't miss a single episode. Follow us on this platform as well as YouTube. That's coming, folks. TikTok, that's coming probably quicker. And Instagram, I'm playing with it now. But if you really want to get a hold of us, look at Facebook. You can look for updates and extra content. Thank you. Maybe you have a local mystery legend or historical facts that need plumbed. Maybe you've got another wild story to share, or maybe you want to tell us something that's going on. Drop us a line. Once again, that email is wildinwoolly, 2 O's, 2 L's, wildinwoollyozarks@gmail.com. I want to thank our guest today, Robert Meyer, been very generous with his time. And I want to thank Kenneth Herren, our producer, and bid you all a wonderful week. And well, folks, until next time, you all be careful. And boys, if you would, please be good to the tourists. Bye now.